Welcome to KSOK Uncensored. Tonight's guest is Glen Morgan. Glen lives in the Pacific Northwest as well as myself, and I've met him at a few events. I am completely inspired by what he's been doing, and it's not just been the past 2 years like so many. Glen has been on a mission for over a decade to wake people up to what is happening at local levels, state levels, etc. Glen, thank you so much for joining.
Well, Kristen, thank you so much for having me on the air.
Oh, absolutely. We have so much to dive into. So, Washington State, I really feel like people need to have eyes on Washington State because so much is tested there. I feel like it's a testing ground for Marxism, really. Would you agree with that sentiment?
It's a testing ground for a lot of dumb, bad ideas. And that's all you have to do is just go to the legislature and you see these terrible concepts that come out. And if you think you live in a red state and you're safe, you're wrong because they test them here first before they bring them to your state.
Yeah, exactly. They sure do. All right. So you've been working on waking people up for over a decade. Talk to us about really what drew you there in the first place, because I've only been at this 2.5 years, like so many others. But what woke you up?
Well, to be fair, I was probably always a conservative activist. I kind of view myself as somebody who loves liberty and freedom, and activism is very important. I was an activist when I was in college. And what really woke me up recently, it really got me more involved about 12 years ago, was just seeing some of the drama related to property rights originally and having young kids in the school system. And so that really drew me back into the process, and much as the Democrats wish that I wasn't involved.
I'm sure they do. All right, so let's dive into a few things that have been happening recently. But one, I first met you when you were speaking at a Patriots United event, and you were really diving into the importance of understanding voter rolls and how if we don't have eyes on voter rolls, they can really be toyed with when it comes to elections. You break down what they are and what we can do to be active.
Sure. The voter rolls are really the place where 11 years ago or so, when I first got into this process, and this really started to concern me, that's where you manipulate elections when it comes to mail-in ballots or where you have a good paper trail for what's going on in the election process. So the voter rolls are really what we have to pay attention to, and it's not sexy and it's not exciting, and it's a lot of work. It's a bit of drama, and a lot of footwork to do it well. And it's only been in the last couple of years that we've been able to actually get people out and do a lot of voter roll cleanup and evaluation. And the more we look at it, of course, that's the more problems we find. And I think that people have to remember that we have caught people misusing the voter rolls in the state. And they back in 2007, we caught Acorn falsifying voter records. They were used in the Seattle Public Library to create just fake voter rolls and kind of stuff in the voter rolls. And I mean, who knew? A lot of people didn't realize that the Seattle Public Library could be used for more than just shooting up meth or taking fentanyl. And so they could also be used for just making a bunch of, I mean, and so we caught them. And I don't know you got to use your library for something, right? And so people don't realize that is exactly the kind of thing that people who have been willing to do dishonest things, that they'll use as a way to manipulate voter roll results, voter election results. And so it's just the easiest way to do it. It's the hardest to get caught. Nobody really looks, nobody's paying attention, and nobody really wants to pay that much attention. And it's a much more effective strategy to be paying attention to what's happening there than it is to be worried about things that we've seen happen in, say, Georgia or Pennsylvania, a different type of voting system. When it comes to mail-in voting, the voter rolls are where a lot of the manipulation occurs. And then, of course, it's also the fact that we send out ballots like confetti, spraying them all over the countryside, and nobody's really tracking what happens to these ballots, whether the actual person who, if they exist, if that's really their ballot that gets sent in, or if other people are voting for them, whether they're doing that at retirement communities, whether they're doing that when they kind of hoover up these ballots in the apartment complexes and homeless camps and other places, and then they can manipulate the voting results by having access to those ballots. So there's a number of different things that I think could be happening. And when it comes to elections, we should go the extra mile to make sure that they're open and transparent and secure, and being willing and having a desire to look at that. There's no difference than what my grandma used to do in Renton when she would go around and doorbell their precinct to make sure that all the registered voters were real, that they hadn't moved, and that they were legitimate. It's only been in the last few years that you're no longer allowed to talk about this, or it's a taboo subject. And that's a dangerous thing when you can't be involved as a citizen and actually go out there and do something productive and help clean up these voter rolls. And so it's something that we don't want to stop doing. And the more we get to know it and understand the process, I think the more we're going to be able to identify problems and help clean up that process.
Yes, absolutely. So it's in your blood. I love that. My grandma was active up in the Kirkland area. So I think that's fantastic to hear. Okay, Glenn, let's pivot a little bit to the election in Clark County. As most people watching know, I was Don Benton's campaign manager. He was running for Clark County councilor, and it was quite the upset. We lost by 30 votes. And I want to get your opinion on this, Glenn, on, this was a nonpartisan race. Don has been a long time known conservative. This was a conservative district, yet we lost to a known Democrat out of Oregon who just moved to Washington recently. So talk to me about your thoughts on why this happened.
Well, it was pretty convenient that they moved her up there. But beyond that, in Clark County specifically, what it really looks like, one of the problems that they had there was that the auditor, there was actually a defect with the Secretary of State database when it came to validating signatures. And that was a legitimate defect. They didn't go public with it, but they emailed all the auditors in the state and said, hey, we're having a problem. And so their system that was checking signatures was delayed. It was a significant problem that they had at the Secretary of State's office. And the Clark County auditor chose to use that delay as an excuse and a reason to reject thousands and thousands of signatures, or ballots, I should say, at a way higher disproportionate level than any other auditor in the state. And that rejection process made it very difficult because you had to go back now and do what they call rehab, which is you had to go back and make sure these people, that their ballot gets counted. And that probably made a difference in several close races in Clark County. And that was a policy decision by the local auditor. He doesn't like me too much right now. I did get him in trouble with the Public Disclosure Commission right around that same time, as I've gotten a lot of politicians in trouble when they've decided to break campaign finance laws. But that was one of the technical issues I think that mattered a lot. There were some other questions related to, I don't know, there's a lot of problems I think with the voter rolls down there, just like there is in the other big cities, or I should say counties that have big cities in them. And there's a lot more work that we have to do to just stay on top of that voter roll, the registrations, and just the ballot harvesting operations that we see going on out there, which is not illegal, but is something that we need to pay attention to.
Yes, we do. And you know what? If that's their game, we have to get better at it ourselves, so we actually have a shot.
Right.
I'm curious if you think that this being a nonpartisan race for the first time played into the outcome.
It may have. Nonpartisan races sometimes can create confusion with the voters in the sense that they don't have a party identification. Sometimes Republicans like that because it's a more left-leaning area and they think that by moderating their message, they may have some people that cross over. Sometimes Democrats like it because it's a more conservative area and they think they can pretend to be a little bit more conservative. So all that really has to do with just running a good campaign and communicating to the voters. Not an easy process. It sounds simpler than it really is, but it's just something that we have to do. I want to always remind people, as much as I care about election integrity, and I really, really do, you don't always lose because the other side's cheating. Sometimes you lose just because you just didn't quite pull it off on the campaign. And sometimes there's other factors that are playing into it. I mean, I did see precinct by precinct analysis that there was a fairly substantial number of conservative leaning voters this cycle that for whatever reason, their own reasons, chose just not to vote. They just flat out didn't vote. And whatever their excuses or reasoning, didn't make our job any easier for those of us who actually want to try to clean this thing up. And that's the kind of decisions that we'd like to try to avoid in the future.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll openly say that something Don and I have spoken about is we should have completely blasted his opponent for being the longtime Democrat that she was, instead of taking the high road and focusing on everything he had to offer on a positive side. you know what? In this day and age, you have to hang them out to dry. If you have that dirt, air it. And I saw that play out in other campaigns also, where they didn't use, the information that they had and therefore lost by a small margin. So I appreciate the back information on that, because it is important that people understand why this is happening. Glenn, I want to pivot over into something that I know you've been doing a lot of research on lately. I dove into it a bit myself, and that's SB 5163. Understanding this was first presented in 2021. I want to talk about what it is, how it passed, because it did pass, and where that's left us today.
Well, this is basically the bill that was passed in 2021, as you said. It had actually been proposed a couple times in various forms in a few previous legislative sessions. But essentially what it does is it gives a way to release violent sex predators. That's a very specific definition in Washington state law. So the worst of the worst violent sex predators in the state of Washington, who are currently housed at McNeil Island, which is an isolated island in South Puget Sound, where they've put violent sex predators. And these are basically people, not your regular sex offenders. Right now, there's 22,000 sex offenders that have been released into Washington state, and they currently live out in public. I mean, that is what's here already. These are the ones that were so bad that the state diagnosed them as being impossible to bring back into the public because they would just reoffend. Many of them were so unstable that they couldn't even stand trial originally. So the worst of the worst. And so they're currently housed, and have been since the late 80s, up at McNeil Island, which is, it's actually a beautiful island. It's 4,400 acres, isolated in Puget Sound, views of Mount Rainier, hardly a terrible place to be. But there's also no kids and no women there for them to molest and kill and rape and attack the way it had got there in the first place. And so at least we didn't have more victims. And that was the agreement that the state had when we created this facility with the public. Now they've decided, and that bill codified the process, that they want to start releasing as many of these guys as they can into the public and put them in homes scattered throughout communities all around Washington state that are unsecured, not very well supervised, and generally in neighborhoods and next to people and families and bus stops and parks and different places. And they use nonprofit or for-profit and nonprofit groups to manage these homes with very little supervision, and pay them a lot of money, paying up to $35,000 a month for just one violent sex predator in a house. And if they stuff it with 5 of them, they get a discount, and they can charge, and somebody can make $107,000 a month based on contracts that we've been reviewing. There was no notification, minimal notice given to local government officials. Were kept out of the loop. They didn't tell the sheriff until like the last minute when they were getting ready to release these violent sex predators. And so understandably, a lot of people have risen up and gotten quite upset about this just in the last month. And so temporarily we've stopped the first house that we were made aware of in Tenino, which is just kind of between Tenino and Tumwater in South Thurston County. But we've since then discovered homes up in Pierce, homes in King County, homes over in Eastern Washington. And so what we're really trying to do is just better understand the scope and the nature and just the fiasco of what's clearly a dishonest and terrible public with bad outcomes guaranteed. One thing I want to point out is that one of the arguments.
Well, Glenn, let's go to commercial, and then we're going to dive back in as soon as we get back.
Sounds good.
Last year in Florida, there were 80,000 pregnancies terminated. And here's a sobering statistic. By midnight tonight, when most of us are sound asleep, another 219 precious boys and girls will have been killed in the state of Florida. I'm Mark Mink. I was conceived in an unplanned pregnancy. My teenage birth mother graciously placed me for adoption. Now I'm the state chairman for the Human Life Protection Amendment Citizen Initiative. Our mission is to amend the Florida Constitution through a grassroots citizen effort so the most victimized and vulnerable are protected. To accomplish this, we need almost 900,000 signatures from registered voters across the state of Florida by February 1st of 2024. With the bloodshed of the most precious happening on our watch, I'm asking for your help to build a wall of protection around these preborn lives, a constitutional wall of protection. Their very lives depend upon it.
back. All right, Glenn, dive back in.
Okay, and I want to make sure that people are clear that the more we dig into this, Governor Inslee and Attorney General Bob Ferguson's sexual violent predator release program, the worse it seems to get. And one of the excuses that have been used over the years to justify this program was that it was so expensive to house these violent sex predators at McNeil Island. And the general number that was tossed around was it costs about $200,000 a year to house them out there, which is about twice what it costs, almost 3 times what it costs to keep them in regular prison. That's true. However, the program that they've created now actually spends more than twice what they spent at McNeil Island to now release them, put them into these communities, with the inevitable result there will be victims in the future. And these are victims that are completely, we don't have to have more victims of pedophiles and violent sex predators in our community. We don't need that. And so this is clearly a policy that's not designed to protect people. It's not good public policy. It's not good for public health. And it's exceptionally absurd that that's the program that they're implementing. And there's a lot more that we're learning from both employees who work internally at the Department of Corrections and DSHS, which is the nominal entity. It's the Department of Social and Health Services. So we're really learning a lot more about what we're getting from records requests, what we're getting from from employees who work there. And so the more we reveal about it, I'm putting up videos myself and articles about it. There's a lot of great activists around the state who are concerned about this. And I think that this story is just going to keep, unfortunately, getting a lot worse as we expose more of it.
Absolutely. Go ahead and can you plug where people can find you?
Sure. They can find me at my website at wethegoverned.com. It's easy to remember. We have government by the consent of the governed, and We the Governed is my website name. You can also see me on YouTube under the same name, and you can see a lot of the videos that I'm sure they try to shadow ban all the time and the articles. But there's a lot of people that see them, and most of the people who go to my website, I don't talk about national issues as much as I talk about issues that matter to those of us who live in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes, I love your videos, and I love your MO, the way you really tell the story with humor, facts. I love it. So you do a great job. So check that out for those who live in the Pacific Northwest, even if you don't. It's a great example of what we should have. We should have someone like you advocating in every state, every county. I want to talk a little bit about really what we should be doing at the county level. And for a long time, I feel like we're so focused on what's happening in DC, and we're so focused on the bigger races. But really, these county and these city leaders, I feel like we vote them in, and then they just go off for the most part and do what they want without even consulting with the folks that even voted them in the first place. You know, here in Happy Valley, Oregon, we have the Clackamas County Commissioner Board. They just voted through to spend, oh gosh, what was it? Like just tons of money. Like, so basically $15 million, they're buying a hotel down the street for $15 million, which the current owner bought for $8 million a few years ago. So they're overpaying through a government grant, a turnkey grant through the government, taxpayer funded. And this is for homeless folks. So homeless folks are going to go live there. I believe really they break it down to we're paying about $147,000 per hotel room for homeless to go live there and leave their garbage and their feces and their drugs and all the violence and the crime that's going to come with that. And, you know, did they once ask local citizens something that we want? No, they didn't. They just did it and spent an obscene amount of money. The other thing that I'm seeing here that just is sneaking by, not a lot of people understand until you expose it, is in Eugene, Oregon. Eugene is the first city for the city leaders to vote through an ordinance that will ban gas hookups for gas stoves in new builds. And so we have this happening right under our noses. And actually, the one that is so on the nose in Eugene is the fact that they actually voted before they voted to put this through. They voted, should we or shouldn't we put this out for a public vote? No, they voted no public vote needed. And then they threw 5-2. So it's just really disgusting what we're seeing happening. And so talk to us about, you know, the importance of being aware of what is happening at the city and county levels.
I'm really glad you're bringing this up as examples, because so important for people to realize that their ability to impact local government is exponentially more significant than their ability to impact whatever's going on in DC. And that's particularly true with people like us who live out in the Pacific Northwest in behind enemy lines, so to speak. But actually, we're 3,000 miles from DC. Our ability to influence what happens in DC is really quite limited. You still should vote, still should pay attention. But your ability to impact what happens in your county commission, your county council, your city councils are substantially more significant, and your ability to communicate about it to your neighbors is substantially more impactful, because right now, for the most part, your local media, if there's any left at all, is completely co-opted by local government anyway, and they will not report what's actually happening. And yet there's a hunger for most people to find out what's happening in their local community. And so I think organizing with people at a local level to learn about what's going on, to expose what's going on, and then communicate that widely with their neighbors, not just on a Facebook page, but genuinely setting up websites, creating groups that spend some time to reach out and communicate to people, you will change both what your local government does and, frankly, who's representing you there, if you do a good job consistently doing that. Now, you mentioned earlier about the humor. The one thing I always bring up to activists around the state or around the country when I'm training them outside of the state too, is nobody likes a bitter critter. So if you live your life angry and pissed, and it's easy to understand why you'd feel that way when you see how local government's operating, but if you live your life that way and you exude they're out there talking to people, you're not going to grow your group. You have to be able to attract people to work with you because you can work well with others. You're not high in drama. You are focused on the truth and exposing the truth, and you're not afraid to confront the other side, but you have to be willing to do it in a way that communicates messages well, I think. And one of those things is recognize the absurdity and the silliness and the complete insanity sometimes in these proposals or ideas that they have, because they're elected officials. They aren't working for you when they propose these things. These aren't grassroots driven ideas. These are ideas driven by special interests, government staff, kickback schemes through grants. All this is a separate kind of way of influencing your local elected officials. And one of our jobs, I think, as citizens is to expose that. And that's the only way to possibly explain. And once you understand where the money's coming from and why they're doing it, a lot of things, I think, related to the house of cards that they've built, the edifice that they've created to justify these really terrible policies, that just folds away. And but you have to be the person who's willing to say the emperor has no clothes, and you have to be willing to point out and laugh at the absurdity of it all. And it's easy to get angry about it. We all do, but you have to be effective in communicating, I think.
Yes. No, I love that you said that, because I do that often. I'm like, I try to talk about things with a humorous aspect to it, because one, it's a coping mechanism, because things are so crazy right now. We have to have a sense of humor. We have to keep that. Otherwise, we're just going to go off the deep end. But two, you're right. You're right. People don't want to be around someone who's angry and all bitter and tense, and no one likes that vibe. So you have to be able to be effective, but then portray the message in a digestible way. So, and you absolutely do that. So I appreciate that about you so much. I don't know, I have to bring up one humorous thing in Oregon. I'm sure you're aware of this. I mean, last year when they voted to spend, was it $500,000 to equip every boys' restroom throughout the state of Oregon in schools with tampon dispensers? I mean, can you imagine the poor janitors' cleanup jobs? They're doing spit wads, but it's actually with tampons. I mean, so we have to have a sense of humor about the absurdity. I sure had a lot of fun with that one. But something that's not so funny. I mean, looking at Washington State now, we have the Domestic Violent Extreme Commission that they're proposing. Talk to us about what this is exactly.
Well, essentially what this is, and this is really a personal project of Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. This is his own brainchild. And so he literally wrote this law, and I believe he did it directly from direction from Washington, D.C. So in this case, this is a good example of Biden failing to do it with the Ministry of Disinformation that he was and of course, Biden was roundly mocked. I mean, remember what made that thing collapse at the federal level was that they put this Nina Jankowicz, this clown-ish weirdo person singing songs, and she was just such a clown that person is who they put in charge. And so that whole thing fell apart nationally, but we were warned by insiders in DC, they're kicking this out to the states. And so all they need is people like Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson to be their kind of lapdog for Biden and do what they couldn't do at a federal level. And so that's what this is, HB 1333. Presume he picked the number 1333 because 1666 was already taken. And so this was his proposal, right? It's to create, they didn't call it Ministry of Disinformation or Ministry of Truth. Instead, even though it's kind of inspired by that Orwellian idea from George Orwell's 1984, instead what they did is they created this board, and they're calling it the Domestic Violent Extremist Commission. That's what he wants to create. And that's going to be in the Attorney General's office under no control over any other elected official, just him. And he's going to stuff it with a bunch of crazies from Evergreen State College and other real special lefty interest groups. And they're going to go and try to identify people like me and probably you and everybody else who's politically disagrees with them on things like maybe you ask questions about masks or vaccines, or you're pro-life, or you go to church, or you can think for yourself, or you homeschool. I mean, anything. If you go to a school board and you're upset about something, you're automatically domestic violent extremist. I just did a video on this, actually. And so the ridicule that he greatly deserves, and everybody, and it was only sponsored by Democrats in order to get in the legislature to get into the process. They should be openly ridiculed for this because it's such an absurd policy. Nothing about it's good. It clearly, and Bob Ferguson even admitted that it clearly tramples on First Amendment rights, freedom of association, all kinds of other aspects that are constitutionally protected, both at the federal level and even more protected at the state level, if you read our state constitution. So it's a ridiculous idea. People should ridicule it. Bob Ferguson deserves ridicule and mockery for the rest of his life for this proposal. And I think we just need to keep, showing it. Now, keep in mind, just because he proposes it doesn't mean it's going to be a piece of legislation. Only 15% of the bills that are proposed every year get through. And so 85% of them die. Most of them deserve to die. And this is one of those bills that deserves to die and just be used as a footnote of mockery in both his resume and the resume of everybody who actually endorsed it in the legislature.
Yes. And aren't they doing this under the guise of like public health?
Right. I think they felt like they got so much mileage and abuse out of COVID-19 and the mandates that they want to simply take that same process and attack political enemies using a public health model. That's really what they mean. And it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, Glen, thank you so much. Always a wealth of information, but entertaining as well. I love it. I really appreciate you coming on. I know we've flashed your website up a few times, but can we put that up one more time, Juan? And Glen, can you direct people on where to be able to find you and touch base with you?
Sure. Just go to wethegovern.com. You can hit the subscribe button, get on my free email newsletter. Also go to my YouTube channel and hit subscribe. Doesn't cost you a thing, but it helps you get more educated, I hope.
Excellent. And thank you for coming on. I really appreciate everything you're doing for Washington State. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We will see you next Thursday on KSOK Uncensored.